Um, Welcome to the National Association Scholars broadcast. What's the future of higher education is our topic for the day. Thank you for joining me and these wonderful panelists. Higher education has been undergoing massive shifts for a while, but especially in the past few weeks, as learning has moved from in-class instruction in most of our campuses to online education. Students have been exiled from their campuses, and colleges are preparing this fall for drastically reduced student bodies, perhaps by as many as 15 to 20% reductions. What does this mean for the future of higher education? Well, to help us find out, I'm joined today by Pete Peterson, who is Dean of the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University, Tom Lindsay, who is the Director for the Center for Education Innovation at the Texas Public Policy Foundation and a former NAS board member, Phil Magness, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research and has been especially prolific in answering the New York Times' 1619 project. And lastly, Richard Vedder, who's a Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute in Oakland, California, Professor Emeritus of Economics at Ohio University, and an active board member of the National Association of Scholars. He's the author most recently of the book, Restoring the Promise. Thank you for joining me today. Our protocol is going to be to give each of you 15 minutes to make a presentation, and then we'll have some back and forth and open this to discussion. So I'm going to start in the order I introduced you. So Pete, it's over to you.
Well, it's a great pleasure and honor to be with you, Peter, and talking about such an important subject. I wanted to talk a little bit specifically as an administrator here at the School of Public Policy and some of the decisions and scenario planning that we've been doing here at Pepperdine. Suffice it to say, the School of Public Policy is one of 5 schools here at Pepperdine University, and we run programming both in the summer and obviously through the fall as part of our Master's in Public Policy programming. We had to transition almost immediately from an on-ground program to online when the pandemic made itself evident in March. Since our founding in 1997, the School of Public Policy has always been an on-ground program valuing the in-class experience and Socratic teaching method as a way of forming future public leaders. The transition immediately to online came with some bumps and bruises along the way, but I have to say as a group, both faculty and our students, we've responded well to these changes. It has meant utilizing this very same Zoom platform that we're talking on now to offer these classes, which are both quantitative in nature as well as discussions that are more seminar style, looking at topics ranging from economic philosophy to American policy history. And so the response immediately, I would say, in the crisis has been evident and good. We just had a virtual commencement ceremony here with our graduating class for the year 2020, which frankly was a bittersweet experience as we value highly the commencement exercises, which are generally held outside in our incredibly beautiful Malibu campus. As we look now towards the summer and fall, we've already made decisions around our summer programming to also transition those classes to online. And as we look through the fall, we're in the midst right now. In fact, following this webinar, I'll be on another Zoom meeting with senior administrators here at the university to look at a variety of fall scenarios, which range from beginning online to a delayed start, which may have us begin in October, to examining an idea that apparently is being floated, although not decided upon, by Stanford University that would essentially cancel the fall semester, begin with a January or early February start the school year, and run consecutively and continuously until August, essentially compressing the school year from January through August. The scenario planning, I know for many of you on this call or in the Zoom meeting, is an exhausting process because it's not just one process, it's evolving. And we're not just responding to decisions made out of Washington, but the decisions made by our state and our county health departments. And so this really does contribute to a variety of different scenarios. When we look at the fiscal impact of these scenarios, I can say just from a meeting here on Monday, our Excel spreadsheet, which was looking at a variety of seminars or a variety of scenarios and the fiscal impacts, had 70 plus different tabs on it. And each one of those tabs had a different related scenario, whether it was changing our contribution to our retirement health plans for faculty and staff, to moving all classes online across the university for the fall semester. So it's been an exhausting process, and in that there's also the element of accreditation. And I think the role that accreditation is playing, and we respond out here in the West to a group called, was known as WASC, but is essentially the Western Area Accreditation Association. There are a number of decisions that need to be made about whether transitioning on-ground classes to online will still bear credits and abide by the accreditation standards that had been set. And so there are a number of spinning plates here in response to accreditation, in considering what are going to be the restrictions by our county health officials, and certainly where academia is more broadly. Because thinking about this as well, we're also making decisions across academia. So we can make decisions about what is best for Pepperdine in response to county health officials, but students who are considering whether to come to Pepperdine or whether to go to Ohio University or whether to go to Georgetown are also making those decisions. And whether certain schools are open in the fall and certain schools aren't, that actually may be a determining factor for prospective students as to whether they're going to be attending one school or the other. At the same time, there are also decisions about whether certain schools will be online in the fall and certain schools will be on ground. And so having said that, that's also another set of decisions that we're having to make in light of other schools that frankly we're competing against in the graduate policy school world. That for students who say to themselves, I'd love to come to Pepperdine, but I only want to come if I can have the on-ground experience. If they're going to go online, why don't I just take some other classes at another school online and see if I can transfer those credits into Pepperdine at a later date? And so this is five-dimensional chess that we're all playing here as administrators. And while I know the subject of the report that NAS has come up with, I think offers some valuable insights about the importance of understanding how schools should be required to abide by certain preconditions in accepting federal aid. I'm just here to offer an administrator's perspective about how we're scenario planning for the fall and all the moving parts that are implicit in the decisions that we're making.
Okay. I guess we just go to Tom.
Thank you, Peter, and hello, everybody. I think, as we look at this crisis, what it calls for is a return to first principles. Part of me thinks that 3 or 4 months down the road, we won't be talking about this. We'll be talking about the next apocalypse. So therefore, let's focus on the things that we knew needed to be reformed in higher ed before this crisis, because they haven't changed. There may be some degree to which this crisis will incentivize universities to pivot and to become more nimble, which was something they needed to do long ago. I mean, the problem, when this COVID crisis is over, the problem that universities had before it will remain the same. Burdensome student loan debt, tuition hyperinflation, and most important, I have a feeling for all of us, poor student learning. And we know that all of those are branches of the same tree, and that's the very well-intentioned effort begun in the late 60s to send virtually every high school graduate to college. That never worked then. Half of the students that enrolled in a four-year college never graduated. They're the ones who suffered the most from student loan debt, that because they didn't have a degree, they weren't able to repay. So sort of adding insult to injury. None of that has gone away. None of that is going to change. And if government comes up with the wrong policies to address this crisis, it's only going to exacerbate the situation. So, as far as I'm concerned, the economic struggles of our students and their parents as they look toward college next year, if I were still a university president, I would be announcing that we're freezing tuition and would have already returned the unused room and board expenses to students. We know that some colleges aren't doing that. I think this is an opportunity for us to offer alternative forms of education to college students. If you look at the polling of high school graduates, report just came out a couple weeks ago, as well as of current college students, it's not that they are going to be leaving the education sphere. They're going to be pursuing it in different forms: career and technical education, online education, etc. And Phil mentioned accreditation. For universities to acquire the nimbleness that they need to respond to this crisis, as well as to the crisis of their own making that I described earlier, they need to have the latitude for innovation. And as we all know here, the accrediting bodies, and I've worked with WASC before that Phil mentioned, they stand primarily as gatekeepers for the higher ed cartel. My hope is that out of this crisis will come a restoration to states of their constitutional power over education, reestablishing 50 laboratories of higher education experimentation from which each state can learn. So I think, to close, that this crisis, while it doesn't really change the system of higher education, it may serve to jumpstart reforms that all of us know have been needed for at least a couple of decades. Thank you.
Thank you. Phil.
Yeah, I wanted to take something of a historical approach here, which is an object of my research attention at the moment, of what higher ed has done in the past in response to pandemics, but also contextualize that and some of the problems that I think we've all been discussing. The first and foremost being that higher ed was already in pretty dire straits in many areas before any of this hit. We know that tuition and debt were going up at astronomical rates. We've seen administrative bloat as a continuous pattern since the 1970s. If you go back to 1974, administration has quadrupled in size relative to where it was just over 35, 40 years ago. We also know that there was an ongoing jobs crisis in certain areas of higher ed. PhD production was outpacing the number of faculty slots available. And I think that's only going to intensify in the wake of this, especially if we start cutting back programs. But the other dimension of it that's interesting is there's a sharp ideological shift that I think we're all aware of that's taken place in higher ed, and it's mostly since around 2000. This has been played out among both the faculty, administrators as a whole, and then the university system, where a left-leaning, and a pretty hard left-leaning majority has emerged on the faculty roles, and that's shifted quite a bit about public attentiveness to the resources that they give to higher ed. Higher ed was already declining in the minds of large segments of the public, especially on the conservative and central, the centrist areas of the political spectrum. Pretty much anyone that wasn't on the hard left. And then on top of that, we've got shifts in what students are choosing to major in. And the pattern that was at play even before COVID is students have been very sharply moving away from disciplines that had veered off in a political direction. I'd argue even been politically captured, and moving toward things in the STEM fields, the hard sciences, some of the quantitative social sciences that tend to be less politicized than something like history, art, philosophy, English. What else is going on top of that? Well, we've thrown this crisis into play here with a massive, and I'd say even unprecedented, at least in modern times, shutdown of the university system. To find a comparable level of closures, you actually have to go back to like the Middle Ages and some of the plagues that hit Europe in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, where they would actually shut down campuses for the better part of a year. If you look at 20th century United States, the standard response to pandemics, and this is everything from the Spanish flu in 1918, some of the polio epidemics that broke out in the 1950s, and there were 2 flu epidemics in the late 50s and late 1960s. The responses to those were much more subdued than what we're seeing now. Even the Spanish flu, which is widely considered the worst of these, they would close campus for 3 to 4 weeks on average in a typical city, and that would coincide with the peak of the flu season. And the idea was that they'd return, finish the semester in person. Of course, they didn't have technology at the time, but it was still a much more softer and subdued response than we've seen today. What does this mean for the future of higher ed? Well, there's some certainly pronounced risks that I see emerging. The first is that we've kind of painted ourselves into a corner in terms of tuition raises as a means to pay for things, and also in terms of going to the public as a means to pay for things. And I'd urge everyone to contrast the current situation, we're heading deep into a recession as a result of the society-wide lockdown, to what happened after the financial crisis in 2008, where even though it's not discussed quite so much as an overt financial crisis relief program, but one of the things the government did in 2008 is they radically increased the amount of funding that went into student-based grants and loans and subsidies for that. You can see a massive uptick and a shift of resources there. And part of this was an unemployment mitigation policy. Part of it, the idea behind it was that if you convince people to go get an extra degree or maybe spend a few more years getting a graduate degree, go back to school, and here's a loan, here's a subsidized grant to pay for it, we'll take you out of the employment pool, and that will ease the public sector recovery. We're in a very different situation right now where that doesn't seem to be an option, especially as long as campuses are closed down or campuses are only on limited operating schedules, as we're starting to see emerge as a possibility for the fall. On top of that, we're in a situation that is much more prone to, or I think is at risk of devolving into a bit of an ideological bunker. That being the case, higher ed, in addition to being an early mover on the shutdowns, has also taken a fairly strident ideological stance, at least if you're following some of the commentary in the Chronicle or even prominent academics on Twitter. They've taken a very strong ideological stance in favor of pretty aggressive lockdown policies for the long run, including opposing efforts to alleviate or relieve some of the shutdowns that are in place, and doing so on pretty strident anti-capitalist grounds, or they're saying that this is where you get the line that the economy is being juxtaposed in a trade-off with health, and we don't want to give up lives for economic activity, even though it's a much more complicated picture than that. The risk here that I see for higher ed is the more that it falls into this kind of ideological bunker of favoring the lockdowns, it undermines also the amount of public support that would be willing to come forth, 3 months from now, when large segments of higher ed are probably inevitably going to be asking for bailouts, going to be asking for public aid to keep or retain certain levels of services and employment, really, for the people that work in it. What can higher ed do on that? I think we have to start asking questions of where we make the tough choices, where we make decisions that involve giving up certain things that probably were not on the table prior to about 3 months ago. Start asking questions about campus lifestyle amenities that have just exploded in the past 30 years, of building fancy rec centers and hotel-style dorms and lazy rivers and rock climbing walls on campus, or employing massive administrative staffs to have an Office of Environmental Sustainability, an Office of Diversity, offices of all these little pet ideological causes that are not really related or directly connected to the delivery of instructional content that students are seeking. All of these are areas that have driven quite a bit of the budgetary push in higher ed, and I think for the long run are going to be continuous drains on public resources. If we start seeing those resources contract, that's where we need to ask the hard decisions to be made of what elements of non-essential, non-instructional components of higher ed delivery in person we're willing to cut. Again, that's going to be a very tough decision because these are constituent interest groups. They are, as economists would say, rent seekers of the resources on campus. And when you put anything before both faculty and administrators that's related to budgeting, you see almost a free-for-all of everyone trying to protect their own turf, their own domains, and ensure their own continuation, even in some of these cases. So that's where things start to get really complicated. And I think, unfortunately, higher ed has backed itself into a corner, both ideologically over the last decade and in various excesses that have already strained the finances that are going to make these decisions much harder than they conceivably should have been or would have been had they taken a more responsible course over the last decade.
Great. Rich, would you like to enlighten us?
Well, I would, except our three distinguished panelists have already enlightened us pretty well. And when you come last, you suffer the hazard of suffering. My name comes at the end of the alphabet. I've long suffered from alphabetic discrimination, as have you, Peter.
Absolutely.
And so I was thinking of changing my name to Aaron so that I would always get to go first on panels and have to say all the great thoughts. I would say one thing that, and I think everyone has said beautiful things and good things and whatnot, but colleges and universities are a ward of the state. There is just no getting around it. Now, some of them more so than others. Pepperdine, for example, is one of the least wards of the state among the private sector. But Princeton University gets 10 times more public money per student than does the College of New Jersey, which is ostensibly a state university located 11 miles away, previously known as Trenton State. So everyone is a ward of the state, and the state is an enormously inefficient allocator of resources and a very inflexible, it becomes very difficult for them to adapt to change. However, and Phil, I think, kind of hinted at this does, and as did others, Pete as well, and Tom, this does offer some opportunities. It is a chance to throw out some things that are inefficient and so on. Obviously, one, and NAS has made this a big point in their recent initiatives, which Peter will probably say a little more about in a minute. We all know that there's an enormous administrative bloat in most of higher education. There are exceptions to this, but it's a huge problem. And this is now an opportunity to attack this. Can we afford 40 million diversity and inclusion coordinators? The University of Michigan, the last time I looked, had 93 diversity and inclusion people, costing $14 million a year. couldn't they get by with 5 people making 500,000 a year? Or why do we need any of them at all? Why do we need one? But at least why do we need $14 million worth of them? These are the kinds of things that are going on. My university owns an airplane that is worth $3 million. The governor of my state owns an airplane that is worth less. I mean, the government does. So my president of the university, whose time is so excruciatingly valuable, will go to Washington in a luxury airplane, and maybe we ought to sell the damn thing. Maybe we ought to use that $3 million to, retain some history professors and so on. The amount of waste and fraud in higher ed is legend. I wrote a book recently about it and so forth. I would comment on one thing Phil said, just as an economic historian. There is one time in history where college enrollments on a relatively quick basis took an enormous decline, and that was World War II. In World War II, we went from before the war to within a year or so the U.S. becoming involved, we took a 60–70% enrollment decline, far greater than now. But as Phil also said, it was a more orderly enrollment decline. We didn't panic. We said, okay, we're closing down for 2 or 3 years. We'll get back to things. And the universities adapted. They decided, well, we'll help with the military effort. We'll use our dorms to put up ROTC candidates and do more training of that, and we will allow the government to use things. We were reasonably adaptable. We need to have that adaptability again. I'm in a university with a $750 million budget. My guess is it's going to take a $150 to $200 million budget hit next year. That is, next year it will spend $550. This year it spends $750, or at least that's what it should do. There are ways you can mitigate these things. You can sell assets. That's something universities ought to think about. Why are universities in the housing business? I mean, what the heck does housing have to do with learning? And indeed, usually on most campuses, even when they are in the housing business, after the freshman or sophomore year, they turn the kids loose, and the kids are much happier living in private housing off campus. No doubt engage in greater degrees of debauchery than they were when they were on campus, but only marginally so. So why don't we get out of the housing business? Why don't we get out of a lot of businesses? Intercollegiate athletics is, it's glorified ball throwing exercises. My school loses $20 million a year on it. That's $1,000 a student. Most universities lose a bit less than that. The biggies come close to breaking even. And schools like Pepperdine, it's probably a more reasonable kind of thing. It may even, in some liberal arts colleges, it might be even a justifiable expense. There are some benefits to having intercollegiate sports. There's some gains from it, and the costs are low, benefits are high. But in general, we ought to get out of this crazy business. Are we in the business of supporting ESPN, or are we in the business of supporting learning? I could go on and on and on with a whole variety of these, but Peter has put a limit on us, and I think a discussion amongst the group would be kind of fun at this point. So I will conclude. Thanks.
Well, thanks to all 4 of you. I don't want to take up much of the time of this session with talking about NAS's own proposal. We've had ample opportunity to say things about that before, but just for background here, we published a about 40-page white paper titled goodness, I'm blanking on the title, Critical Care. And the notion behind it is that the financial crisis facing higher education is so
more proof of what we on our side, being in universities, have experienced, sort of know in our bones. But that message has got to get out to the public. I agree. And I mean, good news is a majority of Republicans now in the polling survey, they get it. On the other hand, those on the left, they can get it, but say, yeah, and that's the way it should be. So I think, yes, Pete is right, continue to make our case, but at the same time, try to use this crisis as an opportunity to institute measures that we know would make higher education much better before anybody ever heard of COVID-19.
Phil, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that you probably think that the transition to a stronger mix of distance education is a good thing. Am I right?
I'd say so, yeah. Yeah, the whole thing on the turn toward distance education is, I think it's broken some of the taboo against that that previously existed. There was quite a bit of resistance to moving things online for a whole variety of reasons prior to this crisis breaking out. But now we've kind of been forced into it, so people realize that, yeah, I can do this. But it's a double-edged sword in a sense. So in one sense, it's broken down the barrier against it, and the other, it's also revealed and realized some of the perils and deficiencies that come with moving everything online. It's a different teaching style. Students don't seem to think it's quite as popular in large part because you're losing the social interaction that occurs not just between the student and the professor, but everything that goes on in the hallways or sitting in the classrooms on campus, which is a big part of the experience. I tend to come from a perspective that views higher ed very close to Brian Kaplan's signaling model, where the degree is the objective that people are after, not the lofty ideals of we're going to become better educated citizens of the world, as much as that may be a consumption good for some people. But if we take the signaling model as our operative principle, the big question that emerges is, does online education deliver the same type of signal as an in-person degree from Harvard, Princeton, and Yale? And I think that's where it starts to break down quite a bit. That's where some of the questions we would be asking about, is this really the same type of delivery, come into play? And in fact, we already know evidence of that because several of these elite institutions were already offering free massive online open enrollment courses, the MOOCs, since probably about the early 2010s. This was a big trend. And in some sense, they were popular. Some sense they moved education online already. But we also found that there's not an enrollment premium. There's not a prestige premium associated with getting a free MOOC certification from Princeton or Cornell versus actually getting a degree from being there in person. So I think we're going to have to wrestle with that quite a bit. If I were to predict where it's going, I see online education is being more suited toward gen ed classes, the stuff that you take freshman year, your English 101, History 101, whereas in-person education seems to have a much more pronounced effect on the small discussion group things that you take that are suited to your major.
Mm-hmm. Well, one way to look at online education is that it's the university of nowhere. Somebody can provide a good course on a particular subject, and only that course, and as long as it's transferable, as Pete was saying, students can go off and fill in their curriculum with courses from many different places. That hasn't happened yet, but it's one of the foreseeable consequences of this. Even if 10% of the students began to think of higher education as a shopping cart where they could fill it up in different places, that would be enough to have a rather dramatic change on higher education. Now, Rich is a proponent of innovation in higher education, I would say, or at least of getting rid of some of the encrusted ways of doing things and looking at other possibilities. Rich, is this a good time to be investing in online providers?
Oh, I don't want to give investment advice out. Although it's an interesting, fortuitous question in a way. I interviewed the head CEO, one of the major for-profit providers Monday, and what are they doing? Most of them, of course, got beaten up by the Obama administration on ideological grounds. They were more or less put out of business by the Department of Education and other henchmen of the Obama crowd. So they're limping along. Some of them went out of business. Kaplan was sold for $1. They're educated to Purdue. And several of these were on the ropes. What are the rest of them doing? Well, Bridgepoint Education, which was a big one. This is the one I talked to, has now got a new name that I can't pronounce that starts with the letter Z. Nonetheless, Bridgepoint is pivoting, if I may use that word, to becoming advisors to traditional universities as to how to better manage online. That goes to some there's opportunity in innovation, others innovation. And so we may see this. I always tell the joke, usually when I'm lecturing to large audiences, that with the possible exception of prostitution, I know of no profession that has had zero productivity advance in the 2,400 years since Socrates educated the youth of Athens, that we have we do the same things that Socrates did, and maybe not quite as well. There's arguably a decline in productivity. So online, I am a believer that we should embrace new technologies and so forth. Higher ed's big problem are lack of incentives, lack of information, and lack of innovation. The 3 I's. That's the problem in a nutshell. So yes, Peter, I am an advocate of innovation, but I agree with several of you who said there are limits to what online education can do. You can't teach a good seminar online. And as much as I love this Zoom conversation, which I think is going swimmingly well, there are limits because students like the interaction, direct interaction with professors. And part of what professors do is more than just lecture and teach. They advise students on career decisions, on all sorts of other things that are part of life, even with the socialization process, which is part of the rich experience you get at a good liberal, at a good residential school like Pepperdine. And so I've said enough.
Well, I'm mixed mind myself over distance education. It looks to me like something that's inevitable, and I deal with inevitabilities. That is, distance education is going to become a much more prominent part of what goes on in post-secondary education. I don't think that it actually fills the bill very well for a lot of gen ed courses. A gen ed course, for example, ought to be sure that it finishes with students who can write a competent essay. And I have yet to see essay writing emerge as something that happens very well online. In some things, like the teaching of history, inevitably involve a certain amount of charisma of the professor who knows the material. And that might be transferable to an online format, but I tend to think that there really is something in the professor who really knows how to command a classroom and bring to life events remote in time and place that is going to be much harder to do when you're in a little box on a Zoom screen. But that would be my ideal, that liberal education survive as a in-person activity at institutions that make a point of recruiting students who are attuned to it, are capable of rising to the demands of the seminar room. But that's not every student, and our idea of sending virtually everybody to college doesn't lend itself very well to these economies of scale that were imagined long ago. We end up now with maybe an opportunity to do some level of education for a great many people, but really good education is going to be more and more an elite enterprise. That's one of the predictions I would make coming out of this. We're going to turn our webinar loose, I think, to public comments. But before I do, I want to make sure that each of you have a kind of concluding comment on where we are right now, and I'll start again with Pete.
Yeah, I would say that what's been said about this transition to online is a ball that was rolling well before the pandemic and is only picking up steam. I think for organizations like the National Association of Scholars and for institutions like the Graduate School of Public Policy, what we have to be very mindful of is how we best use these online tools to not only approximate the in-class experience, but at the same time reach a wider audience, because and that doesn't necessarily have to be within a graduate degree. I think what we're thinking about here too is, are there broader online webinar opportunities for us to reach a wider audience of those who will never enroll in a graduate school? And so I think there's, for the creative, but also those committed to the importance of an in-class experience and trying to derive as much of as we can of that onto the online space, that needs to be our focus.
Tom? You're muted.
What Pete just said, and you know, as far as online goes, I think we want to not fall into a false dichotomy. I'm here in Austin, Texas. I was talking with a government relations person for the University of Texas at Austin. And I said to him, I said, you know, I used to teach political philosophy. I wanted a small class with the seats in a semicircle. I wanted to see the expressions on their faces. You can't do that online. I said, but let me ask you a question. How many of that type of classroom setting do students get here at the flagship University of Texas? And the answer was a little less than half. So these gen ed courses that could be done online are currently being taught in large cavernous lecture halls, 400 students. They never talk to the professor. At best, they talk to a graduate assistant. That's the one that really they have contact with. So no, you can't switch everything over to online, but at the same time, we don't want to say, well, online's cheaper, it's garbage, right? Because a good deal of what the students are getting right now is not student-centric. They're not having contact with the professors. It's being done in assembly line fashion already, and the charge for it is outrageous.
Phil?
There
There you go.
Is that muted? There we go. Oh, jump in on the same theme and actually try to unite that a little bit with the ideological question. I'm going to see if this allows, is it possible to share a screen on this? Let's see. There we go. Yeah, so I'll pull up a chart here that I made, and some of the NAS readers will recognize at least one of these two studies. On the vertical axis here, that was the NAS study that Mitch Langbert published, where he took the ratio of Republicans to Democrats as a proxy for ideology, and he found there's quite a bit of variation across academic disciplines. So the higher you go on this scale, and I have it done on a log scale to get it on the same chart, because some of these ones at the top are like way up here. Like the higher you go on the vertical axis, the more left-leaning the discipline is. On the horizontal axis, that's the break-even point of number of students that have registered to be majors in that discipline since 2010. So This is as of last year prior to the crisis, but anything on the positive side of that break-even point is gaining majors. Anything on the negative side is losing majors. What do we have here? A very clear pattern emerges. The more left-leaning disciplines, people are already voting with their feet. They're running away from them. And the more neutral disciplines, there's not any discipline that's right-leaning. That's actually off the chart down here, some at the bottom. But any discipline that is slightly closer to balance seems to be gaining majors, all before COVID broke out. What does this also tell me? There's one other observation you can just see kind of anecdotally looking in here. The left-leaning majors that are losing students like crazy and that are much further in an ideological direction on the left also tend to have a higher presence on the gen ed curriculum. Their English, their philosophy, sociology, a lot of the softer humanities. And not only that, there are also people in departments that teach these first-year experience classes that aren't connected to a single department, but you always tap the English professor to do it. You never tap the engineering professor to do it. So there's always a really interesting dynamic going on there. What this tells me is I think students are already voting with their feet away from political ideology, yet they're being held in a lot of these classrooms because they're required. They're being held in the classrooms because the gen ed says you have to take X number of hours of English to graduate. And ostensibly that's supposed to be, you know, improving your writing skill, giving you exposure to Shakespeare. In practice, it's writing skills to be assigned to write op-eds about global warming and how capitalism's evil. And instead of Shakespeare, you're reading like postmodernist Marxian takes on economics from people that have no economic training. So there's quite a bit of that going on in there. What does that mean moving forward as we shift to reconfiguring how we do gen eds? I see there might be a silver lining and an opportunity to break up some of this ideological stranglehold that's emerged over on that side of the discipline.
Rich?
Public support of higher education has been in decline. That's been a theme throughout this discussion. And as public support for higher education declines, this poses a vulnerability that higher education was not prepared for, and it's coming to fruition right now. Public endowments are sluggish and will not be rising. State support is undergoing a decline. It was undergoing mediocre levels of support even before, and so on. What's going to happen? I say 500 or 1,000 colleges will go out of business in the next year or two or three. The late Clayton Christensen once had even a higher number. It's Schumperian creative destruction at work. We need that. I'm happy. I'm happy to see a lot of the idiots and people who are supporting these crazy ideologies that are totally incompatible with American values. I'm glad to see them go out of business. I think we need more creative destruction in higher ed. So I look at this as an opportunity. I think it's a chance to call out the worst. And I think the Pepperdines, who are based on a model of with some degree of sanity and some appreciation of what the public thinks, I think the Pepperdines will survive. The Hillsdale colleges and Grove Cities will survive. I think the schools that are going to take go to the cleaners, we've already seen Evergreen's, whatever it is, state in the state of Washington, are disappearing. And I think that is good. So this is a mixed thing. You know, we lose friends, we lose a lot of, there's some good, even the bad schools have some good people. We're going to lose some good stuff, but I think on the whole, this is going to have a positive effect long term on transforming higher ed into a better institution.
Great. Chance, I think we're ready for the next stage of this.
Alrighty. So I have a list of questions queued up here that have been coming through as all of y'all have talked. The first one here is for Phil Magness. What do you think will happen to smaller colleges and universities as a result of the challenges you described facing higher education? The closure rate for small colleges has increased over the past few years. Do you see that rate continuing to climb? Is there anything that these universities can do to offset this?
Yeah, complex question there. I think some of the answer we've already gotten a hint of, as Rich just said. Some small schools that have very niche models that are different from the pattern, different from the norm, the non-evergreen states, I think are actually going to excel in this situation. Hillsdale College offers something that you don't find normally in most other institutions. Grove City, Pepperdine, even some of the larger institutions, George Mason Economics Department, I always like to point out. These are atypical for the norm of higher ed, and having that type of a niche can become a very conscious strategy for the schools that embrace it to differentiate themselves from the pack. Where I do see some obstacles here, and I think Pete mentioned it at the very beginning, accreditation is extremely burdensome on very small schools, especially schools that don't have large endowments. Accreditation is essentially like a private regulator coming in and putting in administrative costs just to operate, just to maintain your status as a school. It's easy for Harvard and Princeton or a large state university to do that because they have teams of bureaucrats. But for a small school in Vermont that maybe has 800 students at it, that's actually a huge chunk of your operating expenses, just complying with and ensuring that your accreditation renews. So even before COVID, we were seeing a wave of these smaller schools going out of business just from the operating costs exceeding what they were able to sustain. Not even massive drops of enrollment relative to where they were historically. It's just all this operating costs. So what does that come up with as a policy solution? Maybe it increases some pressure on accreditors to step back, or maybe we start to reform some of the ways that we do accreditation as a means of allowing these schools to continue to operate and not go belly up. Because otherwise, if we stay the course and keep the level of regulatory interference in place that we already have, I think we're actually setting ourselves up for a much worse scenario by preventing these schools from adapting.
All right, thank you, Phil. So the next question I think is open, though it will likely get picked up by an economist here.
All right.
It says, do you think it is more likely that institutions of higher education will be bailed out like many other firms in the economy, either by states or the federal government, or that they will be bailed out and will not have to respond to significant financial pressure? Another way of putting this is, what is the likelihood that academics and administrators will be mugged by reality? And who would like to answer that?
Well, I start by saying, here's hoping.
Yeah.
I mean, here in my own state of Texas, what the universities are facing is, they're not going to get the money that they want from the legislature because sales tax is down, everything's down. Neither do I think they're going to be able to increase tuition. So what are they going to do? They're going to have to do what the whole country has had to do since the economic meltdown of 2008. They're going to have to learn how to do more with less. That's all to the good.
Yeah, I've just piggyback on that to say Tom's absolutely right, especially at the state level. We're looking at 20 to 30% drops in revenue coming into state coffers over this next year or so. So public school systems that are tied to state revenues are really going to have a difficult time.
Yeah.
As it relates to the feds, there's just not enough. I know this is going to be hard to believe, but there is not enough money to support. We just had a look at the CARES Act funding that had come to Pepperdine. And I'm not going to say exactly what it is, but it is a drop in the bucket relative to the broader concerns that we're having around revenue falls in the next year or so. So there is going to be some very hard realities, no matter what, coming in this next year.
Yeah, if I may, I agree with both of the earlier speakers. In my state of Ohio, we had two universities of large magnitudes, 20,000 student type schools, that were in severe financial trouble before this began. One of them announced it's going from 11 colleges to 5 colleges next fall. They're eliminating 6 of their 11 colleges. It's the University of Akron, a school that a few years ago had 27,000 students, now has 17. Wright State University 4 years ago had 17,000 students, now has 12. When you get 30%, and this is true throughout the Midwest and in the Northeast, where you have stagnant population pools. It's less so in California, certainly less so in Texas or Florida, places like that. But in places where you have stagnant population pools and where the demographics for the next decade don't look particularly good for the 18 to 22-year-old population, you were already facing a lot of this closure. So there will be some mergers. There will be some, attempts to merge libraries and cooperative services and so forth. That's good. And, as I say, I think out of economic adversity can come some positive developments. But I do think a lot of schools are going the way. The small liberal arts colleges that lack distinction are also going to suffer the same things. And some of them, by the way, are abandoning liberal arts and have been for many years in an attempt to be cool. We're going to become business administration schools, and we don't know diddly squat about business administration. In fact, I think almost by definition, no university knows anything about business administration, because look how badly they do administering their own business. So I think that's, well, I've said enough.
Yeah. The only thing I'd add to that is, we asked the question, has higher ed as a whole expended its political capital that it could previously have used to seek political support, to seek a bailout? And I think over the last decade, higher ed has really moved in a direction that has soured its reputation before the public. So people are going to be less willing to give them money today than they were, say, in the financial crisis 12 years ago.
Let me add to that, maybe somewhat more stridently phrased. Much of American higher education is now avowedly anti-American. The goal is to create global citizens. The idea is that America is a bad place that has been bad from the beginning. That's the 1619 Project thesis, that we're a slaveocracy, not a democracy. And that New York Times thesis is pushing on an open door when it comes to higher education. Our humanities and liberal arts departments are almost unanimous in their condemnation of the ideals of American life. Well, that has some effect on recent graduates, but the American people disagree. And if our political leadership is listening, they're going to fairly quickly understand that the moral capital of higher education has been squandered in this decades-long process of delegitimizing the American regime. You can't run against the public order and government and our culture forever. At some point, you're going to come back and want that culture to support you, and maybe it just won't this time.
Yes.
Chance, back to you.
All right, so for the next question, how do we balance the need to attract students with our need for desired university reforms? And that's open to the group here.
Well, I would say we are not trying to dissuade students from seeking post-secondary education. Instead, what we are trying to do is to make them aware of what their options are, what the costs of a four-year traditional degree are, and how they might more quickly, more profitably acquire the training that they need for a job. Now, surveys show 85% of students, they go to college with getting a good job in mind. And of course, that's very understandable with the democratization of higher education following the GI Bill. I think we all know there are better reasons to pursue a higher education, but here we are. So I think that pressure itself that's going to be the most important thing that happens. We've been writing about this and complaining about this for decades, and rightly so. But it seems now finally, as it was mentioned earlier, it seems now finally students have got their eye on the ball. Now, as someone who teaches political philosophy, I'm really sad that 85% of students think a job is the best thing they're going to get out of college. But having been in the professoriate for 30 years, yeah, at most schools today, that's about the best you can hope for.
All righty. So for the next question here, how responsible is the federal government's Department of Education for administrative bloat in higher education? Would abolishing the department help reduce the administrative bloat?
Go ahead, Richard.
Well, I think it's an appropriate question. We are celebrating this week, or perhaps we should have condolences this week. America should be in a state of mourning this week, because it is this week, 40 years ago, that the Department of Education began operation. Exactly 40 years ago. And I think one thing that's very important to keep in mind is the establishment, the education establishment, and both on the right and the left, were not really too happy about the Department of Education when it came into business. It was the National Education Association and Jimmy Carter who wanted it. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, an honest liberal leftist, but a man of some high intellectual ability and qualities, was opposed to the Department of Education being created. The New York Times editorialized against it. The Washington Post editorialized against it. Go look at the record. Yet this thing came into existence. And I think it has had a very detrimental impact on higher education, putting aside the K through 12 issues. Compare higher ed today with 40 years ago. In what ways are it better and in what ways are it worse? That's a long discussion we don't have time to answer, but I think it's pretty hard to come up with an argument that higher ed has been enormously improved by the creation of a centralized bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. I think it's pretty hard to make that argument. That's not the question that was asked, but since I have tenure, I'll answer anything I want.
I just want to piggyback on that because certainly the Department of Education through Title IX and others is at least partially responsible for the growth of what I call the diversity industrial complex on most of our college campuses. But I don't want to get away from two other areas of responsibility. One are these accrediting agencies. We don't talk about that enough, but we're going through our own WASC accreditation process right now. And a lot of the questions they're asking essentially mandate that you have certain offices or positions filled in administration. And that can take on some of these student success centers as well, because part of your accreditation is also showing how many of your students you can graduate, which has created this whole student success complex as well. The third thing is the U.S. News and World Report rankings. I know we don't like to maybe talk about that for fear that maybe somebody is listening, but when you look especially at the undergraduate rankings, some of the elements that determine success or failure in U.S. News are directly related to how many administrators you have working on particular issues. So certainly the DOE is in part responsible, but I think we need to look at these other areas as well.
Yeah, I would just add one thing to that. I agree with what's been said here. Seems to me that at its bottom, what hurts our hearts the most, aside from our concerns with student loan debt and tuition hyperinflation, is the replacement of scholarship by ideology, right? The death of liberal education. That's what we're concerned about. And I think my hope is that through this crisis and the need of states to be nimble, that this will augur a return on both constitutional and prudential grounds to restoring to the states power over education. Now, to be sure, if we do that, there are going to be states that do crazy things. They're already doing crazy things under the current top-down system. But if students are free to go to other states that are offering lower cost or higher quality programs, then those states themselves will be motivated out of mere self-interest to get their act right. Apart from that, given how fractured we are on this issue and the country is, I think that's the last best hope for sparking some sort of reform.
Only thing I'd throw in there is just a reminder, accreditation is the access point to most government money. So these things are symbiotic. They move together and they feed off of each other.
Yes, yes.
I'll add a word on that too. The accreditors exist by the grace of the Department of Education. The Department of Education decides who has the power to be an accreditor. And if you're going to abolish the Department of Education and callers fantasy world, accreditation would go with it. The accreditors would be defanged if there were no Department of Education to back them up. It exists as the gateway to Title IV student loans. It exists as the tool by which the colleges and universities are kept under some supervisory thumb coming from Washington. We probably want something in lieu of accreditation that operates like a good annual audit to make sure that colleges and universities aren't defrauding their students, but as a tool of trying to encourage intellectual excellence in higher education, accreditation is less than nothing. It militates against high quality educational programs and in favor of bureaucracies.
Yes, and let me just add to that here and give credit to someone who was mentored by Rich Vedder. Andrew Gillen, who works for us at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, has just published a study aiming to, while we wait for the Department of Ed and accreditation bodies to be wiped out, that in the meantime, he suggests several what he calls escape hatches from accreditation, things that proceed on an incremental basis, but that will take us toward the end of the road that we all want to get to.
All right. This next question comes from Steve Hayward. He says, Rich, your can of Coke's looking lonely. More seriously, why don't we ever see a revolt of the faculty against the overpaid and growing ranks of administrators?
Well, that's a great question to Steve, who's full disclosure, is a good friend of mine. It's a good question. The faculty role in university governance has generally declined in the last 40 or 50 years, although ironically, it's partly the faculty's own fault, because the faculty in the 60s and 70s, and by the way, I'm in my 56th year of teaching, so I've been around a while, so I've seen it. The faculty in the 70s and 80s, the path to success in a university was to expand your graduate programs. We're going to be an R1 university. We're going to expand our PhD programs. So we created all these PhD programs, and we dropped PhDs out of airplanes over college campuses or the equivalent. And so the faculty became too numerous relative, the supply grew relative to the demand. The demand at the undergraduate level wasn't rising that fast. So the faculty lost economic clout and they lost power. And so now instead of having 70, 80% of the faculty being tenured people, it's 40 or 50%. So people have lost their clout. And it's less so at Harvard and schools like that. You have these world-renowned professors who still have a lot of clout. But at the average American university, the faculty are now employees. They're no longer helping run the university. Shared governance has declined enormously.
To add a bit on that, there's a bit of a schizophrenia going on within most faculty ranks when you ask them this question about the administrators. If you say, is administrative bloat a problem? Like 99% of faculty will say, yes, it's absolutely a problem. But they'll point out kind of like this phantasm version of the administrator that they think is the source of everything. It's this top-down, they call it like a neoliberal bureaucrat that's bringing corporation strategies into higher ed. But this person doesn't really seem to exist. You actually get to putting pen to paper and say, if you poll faculty, are you willing to cut the diversity office? Are you willing to cut the climate change office? Or all these little pet projects on campus? Then suddenly they're up in arms, just as if you were cutting the English department or the philosophy department. So they like to posture that they're opposed to administrative bloat in the abstract, but it's a boogeyman version of administrative bloat. And then the tangible questions that need to be asked about where do you actually cut administrators, they suddenly reverse course and seem not so concerned about it or even dig in on behalf of some of those administrative entities.
All right, so for the next question, it's directed towards you, Phil, but I think anybody can jump on this one. What do you think the prospects for more hybrid models of degree achievement?
Yeah.
Certainly online MOOCs don't carry any prestige or signaling weight, but what about schools that experiment with having students do 1 or 2 years online and then the other 1 or 2 years on campus to receive a degree?
So I think that's the great question. There's a trade-off at play here. The more you move online, the more you give up of the signal. You give up of the brand. And this is why, and I've actually written this argument before, this is why when everyone 5 or 10 years ago was saying that MOOCs are going to take over higher ed and put us all out of business, I was skeptical. And I'm still skeptical of that. A MOOC can only work so far as it's attached to a brand that has some other value it brings to it. And most of that other value is from the in-person networking effect. Most of that other value is from the prestige of the brand that's attached to it. Otherwise, we just have YouTube videos supplanting all courses and could go to like a Khan Academy style of a model. So I think the question here for those of us that work in research and higher ed and teaching is to figure out where that balance point is. How much could be put online without giving up the benefit of the signal that's associated with the brand?
Yeah, and I'll only just jump on that as well, as we're beginning to plan and scenario plan for the fall that's going to include, so we've already made the decision here at the policy school for the first time to offer a track of online classes that no matter what happens, whether we're on ground or not, we're going to be offering online classes this fall. Not the entire degree, but at least a track to see what that looks like. And I think part of the point you raised, Phil, is also who are the first movers, right? One of the ways that you begin to change that brand perception of online or hybrid degree is if everybody's doing it. So I think that's also one of the real sets of questions that we're exploring here at the university is what are other schools doing? And if there is a hybridization of education, how widespread is that going to be? If a Stanford or a Harvard or a UT Austin got out ahead and saying, we're going to do undergraduate education in a hybrid way, that really would fundamentally change the way those kinds of degrees are viewed.
Sorry, had myself muted there for a second. So on the like a follow-up question to online learning, what are y'all's suggestions on how to make distance learning effective, long-lasting, instead of just wishing we didn't have to do it?
Oh, Tom, you're mute.
The best answer to that question is, we don't know at this time. But because we don't know at this time, it's incumbent on us to remove the barriers to innovation for the people who will answer the question.
And I would just add on that, really one of the exciting things, especially for those of us who are concerned with the principles of NAS, is it's made us at the policy school think a lot more differently about who can teach for us, right? And so, we have our on-ground faculty, but the thought of pulling in somebody from AEI in DC to teach a particular class, or to reach out to Steve Hayward, who's taught for us already on ground, but I know it's a difficult traveling experience for him. It really does open some amazing opportunities, to go back to Phil's very good point about branding, that if you establish a brand that's in keeping, say, with the principles of NAS, not necessarily the world is your oyster, but it does open the opportunities that you don't have to have formal visiting professorships to make possible education by scholars who are all over the country.
All right, so we're at 3:30. I'm gonna make this the last question. There seems to be a theme running through many of these questions that I haven't been able to get to yet, but it's mainly, what's the future of conservatives in the academy, and what do y'all recommend for them, and how do they survive since they're already slowly draining from the academy?
Oh, yeah, that's what they used to call the $64,000 question. I mean, look, we know the fate of conservatives at 99% of universities. What few remain are dying out. So then what's the solution? When Nakubo and Moody's and Bain and Sterling first came out with these predictions, as well as Clayton Christensen about 10 years ago, about how many small colleges and universities are on the brink of going belly up, I saw that then, and continue to see that as an opportunity. If conservative investors, as worried as we are about the fate of higher education, and therefore about the fate of America, if they were to swoop down and rescue some of these colleges that already have accreditation, because the problem is to start a new one, 5 to 10 years, $5 to $10 million at the minimum to get accredited. You take a university that already has accreditation. Under financial exigency, you eliminate tenure, you replace it with multi-year contracts. You do your first 2 years online. It would cost very much less than what current universities do. But the kicker is, will companies hire these graduates? Until they do, that's going to be an uphill struggle.
I would just say that I'm short-term pessimistic, long-term optimistic, and by long-term I'm thinking more 8 to 10 years. I think there's been increasing awareness again on a university by university basis as to how far left their faculty and administration has gone, and whether it's state legislatures or donors, I think they're becoming increasingly aware of what is being supported, and I think there'll be increasing drawback and calls for accountability. At the same time, I continue to be excited about what I'm seeing with the growth of conservative student organizations on undergraduate campuses around the country, whether it's YAF or Turning Point or ISI. A number of great organizations are growing, and this is a phenomenon really just in the last 5 to 10 years as far as how they've grown. And where are those kids then going to go when they get out? And so obviously we at the policy school want to be at the receiving end of some of these, but they are going to be kids that I think have prepared themselves through these organizations to argue well for conservative principles, and they'll be battle tested for having gone through 4 years of a politicized undergraduate education. And I think that's a generation we really need to support, and I'm very optimistic about.
I agree with Pete completely. I think in the long run, conservatives will not only survive, I think they'll do better than they're doing now, because the public is more conservative than the establishment. The public is saying no to a lot of this leftist stuff, and they want a more conservative environment, and they'll get it one way or the other. I think it's going to come. We don't have time because if in the academic world we pay no attention to resources, but in the world we're operating in right now, we have a resource constraint. It's called time. I would like to say more, but I will defer.
And just to echo that whole point, it's not only the general public that is much more toward the right or even the political center than the faculty, it's the incoming students. Students are pretty representative of the political mainstream of the United States, maybe a little to the left of center for the average person, but faculty are on the far left, and they've moved to the far left. I don't know of any business model that can exist for the long term that declares open warfare on its main customer base, on its incoming students. And I think, unfortunately, that's where academia has painted itself into at the moment, is that they are at odds ideologically with even the normal incoming student. That can persist for a period in the short term with subsidy, with all sorts of other institutional supports, but it's not sustainable for periods of many years or many decades.
I'll just add that I've said on many occasions that higher education should not be confused with the existing colleges and universities. There's many ways to become an educated person that don't depend on spending $70,000 a year or something like that to get an undergraduate degree or a graduate degree. Those are nice to have, but look in these pictures here. There's books behind us folks. We are readers, and everyone who is educated is to a certain degree self-educated. Conservatives aren't going away. They are a main part of the American political spectrum, and they are substantially represented in the world of ideas and intellectuals. You wouldn't think so if you were just counting up the faculty members at colleges and universities, but there's career opportunities elsewhere as well. So there is a world in which I'm optimistic that conservatives will have a voice and a presence. New institutions will emerge as the old ones die off. And in that new world, I think conservatives will have a prominent place.
All right. right, Peter, would you like to close us out?
Oh, I think we've pretty much closed ourselves out here. I would like to thank all four of our guests and the callers for a very lively hour and a half or so. I think the technology impresses me. I hope it impresses everyone else as well. Zoom may be owned by a Chinese consortium, but it's providing something that the free market is finding very useful. So I'm grateful for Zoom as well. Thank you all, and I hope to see you at another webinar sometime soon.
Thanks all.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.